Yesterday, the president dug in and said only Congress could fix this and declared he would not back down because he charged illegal immigrants want to, quote unquote, infest the U.S. and Democrats are letting them. Well, today, a slightly different tone, as he said his inclination is to be strong because if he looks weak, the border will be overrun, but he also wants to show compassion. He acknowledged to House Republicans last night in that urgent meeting he knew the party was facing political pressure from those images on the border, so this executive order keeps families together while in custody, speeds up their cases, and brings in the Department of Defense to help provide shelter. The executive order declaring in part the Attorney General shall promptly file a request with the U.S. District Court for the Central District of California to modify the settlement agreement in Flores versus Sessions in a manner that would permit the secretary, under present resource constraints, to detain alien families together throughout the pendency of criminal proceedings for improper entry or any removal or other immigration proceedings. Now, that settlement mentioned there is from when Barack Obama was president, and interesting that a California judge said then that kids are being held in, quote, widespread deplorable conditions. So the remedy was that they could only be detained with their parents for 20 days. The ACLU tonight is immediately declaring that all of this may run afoul of that court settlement, saying, quote, children don't belong in jail at all, even with their parents, under any set of circumstances. If the president thinks placing families in jail indefinitely is what people have been asking for, he's grossly mistaken. Well, here's the president's side.
I didn't like the sight or the feeling of families being separated. People haven't dealt with it, and we are dealing with it. So step by step, just like we dealt with North Korea, we dealt with Iran, we dealt with an economy that was heading in the wrong direction. We're keeping families together, and this will solve that problem. At the same time, we are keeping a very powerful border, and it continues to be a zero tolerance.
Now, some Republicans wanted the president to call the bluff of Democratic leader Chuck Schumer, has been complaining about conditions for the kids, but said he would block any legislative fix to actually help those kids. So the president, though, decided to act on his own, hoping he'll get some credit heading into these midterms in a few months for striking a balance. But the potential problem for him in the short term is that by acting now in an executive way, it might take the pressure off Congress to actually pass any kind of legislative fix.
Do you get a sense from the White House today, Ed, what put him over the top to go in this direction? Was there a trigger?
Well, we know at previous times when the president acted in Syria, for example, he said that he saw disturbing images of kids facing a chemical attack in Syria. That moved him to military action. In this case, the president himself said that he heard from his wife, the First Lady, Melania, as well as his daughter, Ivanka, and they were saying that, look, these images are striking, and you've got to find a better balance here. And so the president, frankly, acknowledged that there was some pressure in his family. And last night, remember, he went up and got a little bit of an earful from House Republicans who are facing the voters in a few months and are saying, look, we got to do something here, Bill.
Thanks, Ed. Good to see you tonight from the White House, Ed Henry. So then the president ultimately wants Congress to fix the immigration matter, but that's a lot easier said than done. Up the hill we go on Capitol Hill, and Peter Doocy has that part of the story tonight. Hey, Peter.
Bill, we just got to look into the future of what might actually go down on the House floor tomorrow when that pair of immigration bills comes up and is considered, because just a few minutes ago, the Speaker of the House, Paul Ryan, was confronted and got an earful from an angry Freedom Caucus leader, Congressman Mark Meadows, on the House floor. I'm told there's some sort of disagreement about what provisions are actually going to be in the more conservative package on the floor tomorrow, best known as the Goodlatte bill, which does not provide a pathway to citizenship for DACA recipients. But this Meadows v. Ryan confrontation indicates that Republican leaders are still just as stuck as they were this morning when the whip team realized they were so short on votes for the so-called compromise bill that leadership likes. They arranged for buses to take 24 lawmakers who needed to be worked on to the White House for a second consecutive day of FaceTime with President Trump, who says he just wants to get something done and whose executive order on keeping families together addresses an issue that was not on Congress's radar when these bills were being put together. But those buses all came back to the Capitol without 24 new commitments to support the Republican-backed compromise bill, which is trying to lure the more conservative members now with an appropriation for the full $25 billion in border wall money that President Trump wants. So it's entirely unclear if anything has even close to the amount of support needed to pass tomorrow. And just across the street from where I am standing right now in the Rayburn House Office Building, Republicans and Democrats are huddled in a conference room, in a hearing room actually, going over the rules for these 2 votes tomorrow. That is the last thing that needs to happen before they can actually have the vote tomorrow. Bill.
One of the big messages last night when the president was there, he wants those 4 pillars, right? That's a Visa lottery, the $25 billion for the wall. Is all of that in both of these bills that could be considered?
No, and that's part of the issue right now. The Goodlatte bill, which is not believed to have anywhere close to the amount of support, does not provide a pathway to citizenship for DACA recipients, which is something that a lot of the more moderate members of the House want to do. And remember, a lot of those moderate members, a couple dozen moderate Republicans, almost joined with Democrats to do this discharge petition, which would have let them bring something to the floor, a very bipartisan bill, even though Speaker Ryan and Leader McCarthy did not want it. The leadership was able to avoid that with this compromise bill that leadership is now calling the leadership bill, that addresses border security, and it also gives a pathway to citizenship for DACA recipients who were brought to this country illegally as children. But that is something that a lot of members of the Republican conference just cannot stomach.
Sounds kind of iffy. We'll see what they do tomorrow. Thank you, Peter. Nice to see you tonight. Peter Doocy. With me now, Brit Hume, Fox News senior political analyst. Brit, how you doing? And good evening.
Hi, Bill. Nice to see you.
Let's get to the politics and the optics of all this in a moment here. But what is your sense about this executive order? Does this fly?
Well, I think it may help the president and his party politically, because he will be seen as acting to end this practice of stripping these kids away from their families. However, as a substantive matter, I don't think that it really does very much. He says we're going to continue to hold these people who we arrest for illegally crossing the border. We're just now going to hold them with their kids. But that runs right into this consent decree that we've all been hearing about in the Flores case, which is effectively law, which says you can't hold kids for longer than 20 days. And he is saying that this order has to be done in a way that doesn't run into that. Well, we'll see how well that works. I think there's a significant chance the order will be struck down. So we'll see how far that goes. Make no mistake about it, Bill. The reason why Democrats are complaining about this order is that what they wanted the president to do with the stroke of a pen was to go back to the previous practice of catch and release. And if you had a child with you and you crossed the border, because you couldn't hold a kid for more than 20 days, that meant that you couldn't separate them from the families. That meant that the kid was effectively a get out of jail free card, and these people would be, they would be scheduled or they set for a hearing, and then they would melt away into the countryside when they were released and never show up for their hearings. And so that whole catch and release practice, while it was well intentioned, didn't work. And this is what the Trump administration is trying to get away from. Yeah. And that's what brought us to where we are. And
you have a keen experience with this, however. In Virginia, you work at a facility that brings in illegal immigrant children. And what is your experience about how they're treated, or what happens there, Brett?
There are 2 kinds of immigrant children who are separated from their families. One kind, and this is the largest group, are unaccompanied immigrant minors who arrive on our borders and cross our borders, and their parents are nowhere to be seen. And they make a harrowing journey through Mexico from these broken Central American countries to get here, and they display unbelievable courage and wherewithal to do it. And they come into this country, and because they're entitled to a hearing, they have to be housed somewhere until their hearing. And there are 100 facilities around the country which accommodate these kids. These same facilities also accommodate these children who are separated at the border from their families. I'm on the board of a Christian youth home out here in Virginia, not too far from Washington, which takes 60 or so of these kids at a time, and they take care of them, and I must say they take very good care of them until they can be placed with families or otherwise situated to await their hearings. That's how the system works. And what we've seen at the border is a number of cases where these kids arrive and they expect, I'm told by the people at the youth home where I serve, a lot of them expect to be separated from their parents, and they're ready to deal with that. But as we've seen, there are a number of cases where these kids certainly are not ready for that, and it's a terrible experience for them. And that is what the administration is trying to deal with now, because once they revoke catch and release, these separations were inevitable. And so they're now saying, well, okay, we're not going to do catch and release, but we're not going to separate them either. Well, we'll see how that turns out as a matter of law.
I mentioned the optics. Jonah Goldberg was with Sandra and me earlier today in America's Newsroom, and he thinks the White House screwed it up. But that was earlier today. This is what he said. Britt, have a listen.
This has been the worst messaged policy screw-up, I think, of any president in my lifetime. Regardless of what you think of the moral horror at the border, and I do think it's a moral horror, just as messaging, this has been a disaster.
All right, reflect on that quickly.
Well,
and I mean, have they made up ground since that comment from 10 o'clock this morning?
They may have, Bill, but they were well in a hole on this. Now, part of it has been some of the worst and most distorted media coverage of an issue that I think I've ever seen in my life.
Interesting.
And it has gone to the point where, you know, you're hearing Nazi comparisons from journalists who, you know, might otherwise be considered respectable. So this is what they're up against. But they certainly, I don't think when they instituted this, they ended catch and release back in April, they expected this. I don't think they expected they were going to suddenly this was going to blow up into the issue that and they clearly, the administration officials clearly were not ready for it, because there are a number of things you can say. They've said them, but they never really penetrate. One of them is that if you're an American citizen, a parent, and you commit a crime and you're thrown in jail, you're going to be separated from your children. I mean, and you could make an analogy to this. These people cross the border, and if they don't cross at a legitimate transit point and you know, file for asylum or whatever it is they want in the right way, they've committed a crime. They're subject to separation from their children. But that argument really never quite penetrated.
I'm just looking at the president's tweet from just a few hours ago. Don't worry, the Republicans and your president will fix it. And there's a video attached to that we're going to play a bit later here before the rally begins.
Yeah, we haven't heard the last of this, Bill. This is going to go on for a while, because I'm not sure that this executive order will pass muster in the courts. Because of that consent decree that said 20 days is the max. We'll see how well that works out. They're going to try to get it changed. Maybe they will, but we'll see.
Thank you, Britt. Appreciate your